You know that moment when someone looks at you and decides they know exactly who you are, what you're worth, and what your place should be in this world. When they dismiss your stories as rambling tales from a confused old woman. When they roll their eyes at your clothes, your choices, your very existence. I lived with that judgment for 3 years. 3 long years of being treated like I was nothing more than a burden, a relic from a bygone era who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of modern life. My daughter-in-law made sure I knew exactly how little she thought of me, how embarrassing she found my presence, how much she wished I would just fade into the background of their perfect life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what she didn't know about the woman she so easily dismissed. Here's what happens when someone spends so much time telling you that you live in your own world that they forget to ask what that world might actually contain. This is my story, and I promise you, it's not what anyone expected. My name is Sharon Butler, and at 68 years old, I thought I had seen enough of life to handle whatever came my way. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for the day my son Michael brought home his new wife, Jessica, and introduced her as the woman who would change our family forever. She was right about that part, though not in the way any of us imagined. The first time Jessica walked into my small apartment, I watched her eyes sweep the room with barely concealed disdain. She took in the modest furniture I had carefully chosen from estate sales, the well-worn but clean carpet, the simple curtains I had sewn myself. Her gaze lingered on my collection of thrift store finds displayed on the mantle, each piece holding a memory, a story, a moment of joy when I discovered something beautiful that others had overlooked. "Oh," she said, and that single word carried more judgment than most people manage in entire conversations. "This is very quaint." I smiled and offered her tea, the way I had been raised to welcome guests into my home. My mother always said that hospitality was about making others feel comfortable, not about impressing them with what you owned. But as I served Jessica the good china I had saved from my marriage, I could see her cataloging everything she saw as evidence of my limitations. Michael seemed oblivious to the tension crackling between us. My son, bless his heart, has always seen the best in people, sometimes to his detriment. He beamed as he told me about Jessica's career in marketing, her ambitious plans, her sophisticated tastes. I listened and nodded, genuinely happy that he had found someone who made him smile the way his father used to make me smile. "Mom tells the most incredible stories about Dad's business adventures," Michael said to Jessica as we sat around my small dining table. "You should hear about the time he convinced that hotel chain to let him redesign their entire concept." I felt a familiar warmth as I began to share one of Harold's stories, the way he had transformed a failing resort into a destination that attracted visitors from around the world. Harold had such vision, such an ability to see potential where others saw only problems. I loved telling these stories because they kept him alive in my memory, kept his dreams and accomplishments from fading into the past. But as I spoke, I noticed Jessica's expression growing more skeptical with each detail. She exchanged glances with Michael, the kind of look that passes between people who think they're witnessing something embarrassing. When I finished, she smiled that thin smile I would come to know so well. "That's such a sweet story, Sharon," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's wonderful how you remember Harold. Sometimes grief can make our memories so much more elaborate than they actually were." The words hit me like a physical blow. She was suggesting that I was making up stories about my deceased husband, that my grief had somehow twisted my memories into fantasies. I opened my mouth to respond, to show her the photographs, the newspaper clippings, the awards Harold had received, but Michael was already changing the subject, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. That was the beginning of what would become a pattern. Every story I told about Harold's success, about the life we had built together, about the business empire he had created from nothing, was met with Jessica's barely concealed skepticism. She would nod politely, make non-committal sounds, and then later I would overhear her talking to Michael about your mother's elaborate fantasies, and how sad it was when elderly people couldn't distinguish between reality and wishful thinking. The truth was, I had made a choice after Harold died. A deliberate, conscious choice that Jessica couldn't possibly understand, because she had never learned to value anything that couldn't be displayed for others to see. When Harold passed away, 5 years ago, I could have maintained the lifestyle we had built together. I could have kept the mansion, the staff, the luxury cars, the country club memberships. I could have continued living in the world that Harold's success had created, for us. Instead, I sold the house and moved into this modest apartment. I donated most of our expensive possessions to charity, keeping only the pieces that held genuine sentimental value. I began shopping at thrift stores, not because I had to, but because I found joy in the hunt for hidden treasures. I took public transportation instead of hiring drivers, because I enjoyed the chance encounters with strangers, the glimpses into lives different from my own. People assumed I had made these changes because Harold had left me with limited means. I never corrected them. There seemed to be no point in explaining that I had chosen simplicity over ostentation, that I had discovered a freedom in having less that I had never experienced in having more. The truth was more complex than anyone cared to understand, so I let them believe what they wanted to believe, but Jessica's assumptions went beyond simple misunderstanding. She took my modest lifestyle as evidence of failure, of decline, of a pathetic old woman clinging to delusions of past grandeur. She treated me like a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when you lived beyond your means and then had to face reality. Sharon, you really need to be more practical about your finances, she told me one afternoon as we waited for Michael to return from work. She had insisted on coming with him to visit, though I suspected her real purpose was to inventory my belongings and judge my choices. I know you want to maintain your dignity, but there's no shame in admitting that money is tight. Michael and I could help you apply for assistance programs. I looked up from the sweater I was mending, a skill I had learned from necessity during my childhood but continued from choice in my later years. That's very kind of you, Jessica, but I manage just fine. She sighed, the exaggerated sigh of someone dealing with a particularly stubborn child. Sharon, living in denial isn't helping anyone. We've all seen your apartment, your clothes, the way you count coupons at the grocery store. There's no judgment here, but you need to face facts. What she didn't understand was that I counted coupons because I had learned to find satisfaction in small savings, not because I needed to. I shopped carefully because I had discovered that the process of making thoughtful choices brought me more joy than simply buying whatever I wanted. I wore modest clothes because I had realized that true elegance came from how you carried yourself, not from the labels in your closet. But explaining this to Jessica would have required her to believe that someone might choose simplicity over luxury, humility over display. She had organized her entire life around the acquisition and exhibition of status symbols. The idea that someone might deliberately step away from that world was incomprehensible to her. As the months passed, her treatment of me grew more dismissive. She would interrupt my stories with comments about how the past is the past, and how I needed to focus on reality. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I mentioned Harold's business achievements, she would pat my hand patronizingly and suggest that perhaps I was embellishing the details. The worst part was watching how her attitude affected Michael. My son began to look embarrassed when I spoke about Harold, as if he were ashamed of my delusions. He started cutting my stories short, changing subjects abruptly when I mentioned the life his father and I had built together. I could see him beginning to doubt his own memories. beginning to wonder if perhaps Jessica was right about my tendency toward fantasy. "Mom," he said to me one evening after Jessica had made a particularly cutting comment about my imaginary past, "maybe it would be better if you didn't talk so much about Dad's business. I mean, he was a good man and a good father, but some of those stories, they seem a little far-fetched." I stared at my son, the child I had raised to be honest and kind, and realized that Jessica's poison was beginning to work. She was rewriting our family history, casting doubt on the foundation of everything Harold and I had accomplished together. She was making Michael ashamed of his own father's legacy. That night, I lay awake thinking about the boxes in my bedroom closet, the ones containing newspaper articles about Harold's business empire, photographs of him receiving awards, contracts and documents that proved every word I had ever spoken about his success. I could have shown them to Jessica and Michael at any time. I could have ended her skepticism with a single manila folder full of evidence. But something held me back. Perhaps it was pride, the stubborn belief that the truth should be able to stand on its own without requiring proof. Perhaps it was the realization that Jessica's disbelief said more about her than it did about me. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that someone who could dismiss an elderly woman's cherished memories so casually wasn't someone whose opinion truly mattered. Instead, I continued living my quiet life, tending my small garden on the apartment balcony, volunteering at the local library, maintaining the routines that brought me peace. I watched Jessica redecorate Michael's apartment with expensive furniture they couldn't really afford, observed her constant need to photograph and post every meal, every outfit, every moment of their life together, as if it only had value once it was displayed for others to see. She would often make comments about my simple ways, delivered with a tone that made it clear she considered simplicity to be just another word for failure. "Sharon still thinks you can make a good meal with ingredients from the grocery store," she would tell Michael, laughing as if the idea were quaint beyond belief. She doesn't understand that quality costs money. What she didn't know was that I could have bought the most expensive restaurant in the city without affecting my monthly budget. What she didn't realize was that I chose to cook simple meals because I had learned that the most meaningful experiences often came from the most humble circumstances. The dinner parties Harold and I had hosted in our mansion, with their elaborate menus and imported wines, had never brought us as much joy as the quiet evenings we spent together in the kitchen, sharing stories while we prepared simple meals with our own hands. But Jessica lived in a world where value was measured by price tags, where worth was determined by what others could see and envy. She had never learned that true wealth might be found in things that couldn't be purchased or displayed. She had never discovered the peace that comes from wanting less rather than having more. Her comments became more frequent and more cutting as time passed. She would joke about my wardrobe, suggesting that Michael should take me shopping for more appropriate clothes. She would make offhand remarks about my apartment, wondering aloud why I insisted on living in such diminished circumstances. She would question my stories about Harold with increasing boldness, sometimes openly laughing at details she found unbelievable. "Sharon, honey," she said to me one afternoon as we sat in my living room, "I think it might be good for you to talk to someone about these elaborate stories. Sometimes after we lose someone important, our minds can play tricks on us. We start remembering things that never really happened, or we make small events seem much bigger and more important than they were." I set down my teacup and looked at this young woman who had appointed herself the judge of my mental faculties. "Jessica, what makes you so certain that my memories are incorrect?" She laughed, that brittle sound that contained no warmth or humor. "Well, I mean, look around you. If Harold was really this successful businessman you're always talking about, where is the evidence? Where are the investments, the properties, the lifestyle that kind of success would have created? You're living in a one-bedroom apartment, shopping at thrift stores, clipping coupons. Those aren't the circumstances of someone whose husband built a business empire." What she said was logical, from her limited perspective. She couldn't imagine that someone might choose to live modestly despite having other options. She couldn't conceive of values that weren't measured in material possessions. Her world was so narrow, so focused on surface appearances, that she literally couldn't see any other way of being. "Perhaps," I said quietly, "there are things about my circumstances that you don't fully understand." "Oh, Sharon," she said, and her voice was full of pity that felt more insulting than anger would have been. "I understand perfectly. You're a widow living on Social Security, trying to maintain your dignity by creating stories about a past that never existed. It's actually quite common among elderly people who feel forgotten or overlooked. You're not fooling anyone, but we love you anyway." The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. She wasn't just dismissing my memories, she was pathologizing them, turning my love for Harold and pride in his accomplishments into symptoms of mental decline. She was reframing my entire identity as a delusion born from loneliness and irrelevance. But what hurt most was the realization that she genuinely believed she was being kind. In her mind, she was gently helping a confused old woman face reality. She couldn't see that her help was actually an assault on everything I held dear, an attempt to erase the man I had loved and the life we had built together. That evening, after Jessica and Michael had left, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about the strange turn my life had taken. I had imagined that my later years would be peaceful, that I would be able to enjoy the fruits of Harold's labor while sharing his memory with our son and any grandchildren who might come along. I had never anticipated that my own family would become the source of such pain that I would have to defend my husband's legacy against accusations of fantasy and delusion. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out one of the boxes I had carefully packed when I moved from the mansion. Inside were photographs of Harold receiving an award from the governor for his contributions to the state's tourism industry. There were newspaper clippings describing his innovative approach to hospitality design. There were contracts showing his ownership of multiple properties, financial statements documenting his success, letters of recognition from industry leaders who had sought his advice. But as I held these pieces of evidence in my hands, I realized something important. The truth didn't need defending, not from someone who was determined not to see it. Jessica's disbelief wasn't really about Harold or his accomplishments. It was about her need to feel superior, her inability to accept that she might not understand everything about the people around her. I put the papers back in the box and returned it to the closet. If Jessica wanted to believe that I was a delusional, old woman living in poverty, that was her choice. I knew who I was, what Harold had achieved, and what we had built together. Her ignorance couldn't change the truth, no matter how loudly or frequently she proclaimed it. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to see the real damage that Jessica's attitude was causing. Michael started treating me differently, speaking to me with the careful patience people reserved for the mentally fragile. He began fact-checking my stories, questioning details that he had never doubted before. I could see him looking at my apartment with new eyes, calculating the cost of my possessions and finding them wanting. Worse still, he began making excuses for reduced contact. Visits became shorter and less frequent. Phone calls were cut short when I mentioned Harold or the life we had shared. I realized that Jessica wasn't just rewriting history. She was systematically isolating me from my own son by convincing him that my memories were symptoms of decline rather than treasures to be preserved. The cruelest irony was that Jessica had no idea what she was destroying. She thought she was saving Michael from an embarrassing mother who lived in fantasies. She couldn't see that she was actually severing his connection to a family legacy that could have enriched his life immeasurably. Harold's wisdom, his approaches to business and life, his strategies for success and happiness, all of this was being lost because Jessica couldn't imagine that an elderly woman in modest circumstances might have valuable knowledge to share. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me with a mixture of pity and frustration, as if I were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She seemed genuinely puzzled by my contentment, my ability to find joy in simple pleasures, my lack of bitterness about my reduced circumstances. In her world, someone in my situation should have been desperately unhappy, consumed with regret and envy. What she couldn't understand was that I had made a deliberate choice to trade material wealth for spiritual freedom. When Harold died, I could have continued living in the style to which we had become accustomed. But I had discovered that the pursuit of status and possessions had begun to feel hollow without him to share it with. The mansion felt empty, the expensive dinners tasteless, the luxury meaningless without the person who had made it all worthwhile. So I had chosen differently. I had chosen to live in a way that honored the values Harold and I had shared before success complicated our lives. I had chosen to remember what it felt like to find joy in small things, to appreciate beauty that didn't cost a fortune, to measure worth by character rather than possessions. But Jessica lived in a world where such choices were incomprehensible. She couldn't imagine voluntarily giving up luxury, deliberately choosing simplicity, or finding peace in having less rather than more. To her, my lifestyle could only be explained by failure, decline, or delusion. As winter approached, the tension between us reached a new level. Jessica had become bolder in her assessments of my mental state, often speaking about me as if I weren't present. She would tell Michael, while I sat right there, about her concerns regarding my increasing detachment from reality. She would suggest, with false concern, that perhaps I needed professional help to deal with my obvious difficulties processing grief. The final straw came during Thanksgiving dinner at their apartment. I had brought a simple green bean casserole, made from a recipe that had been in Harold's family for generations. It was nothing fancy, just fresh green beans with a homemade cream sauce and almonds, but it had always been Harold's favorite holiday dish. As we sat around their expensive dining table, surrounded by Jessica's carefully curated decorations, and eating from her wedding china, she began telling the other guests about my touching but concerning tendency to live in the past. "Sharon has these elaborate stories about her late husband," she said, smiling at me with false fondness. "She talks about him as if he were some kind of business tycoon, building hotels and resorts all over the country. It's really quite detailed. She's created this whole mythology around their life together. The doctors say it's common for widows to idealize their marriages and create fantasies about their husband's importance." I felt the blood drain from my face as the other guests turned to look at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. Jessica was publicly humiliating me, using my cherished memories of Harold as entertainment for her dinner party. She was turning my love for my deceased husband into a pathological symptom to be discussed and analyzed by strangers. "Jessica," I said quietly, "perhaps this isn't the appropriate time or place for such a discussion." "Oh, Sharon, there's nothing to be embarrassed about," she said, reaching over to pat my hand with condescending affection. "We all understand that grief can affect our perception of reality. The important thing is that you're surrounded by people who love you and want to help you process these feelings in a healthy way." Michael sat silent through this exchange, his face flushed with what I hoped was shame, but suspected might be embarrassment at my behavior. The other guests nodded sympathetically, clearly viewing me as a pitiable figure whose delusions needed to be handled with kid gloves. That night, I went home to my quiet apartment and sat in Harold's old reading chair, the one piece of furniture I had kept from our previous life together. I thought about the woman I had been when I met him, young and full of dreams, but uncertain, about my place in the world. I remembered how he had encouraged those dreams, how he had built his empire not just for financial success, but to create a legacy that would matter, that would last. Harold would have been heartbroken to see how his memory was being treated, how his accomplishments were being dismissed as the fantasies of a grieving widow. But I think he would have been even more disappointed to see how I was allowing it to happen, how I was letting Jessica's ignorance taint the beautiful life we had shared together. I realized that my silence, which I had thought of as dignity, was actually a form of cowardice. By refusing to defend Harold's legacy, I was allowing it to be erased. By not correcting Jessica's assumptions, I was enabling her to poison my relationship with Michael. By choosing peace over truth, I was betraying everything Harold and I had worked to build. But I also knew that simply showing Jessica documents and photographs wouldn't solve the deeper problem. She had revealed something fundamental about her character, something that went beyond mere misunderstanding. She had shown herself to be someone who could casually dismiss an elderly person's most treasured memories, who could publicly humiliate someone who had never done her any harm, who could systematically work to isolate a mother from her son. The question was no longer whether Jessica would ever understand the truth about Harold's success and my circumstances. The question was whether I would continue to allow her cruelty to define my relationship with my family, whether I would let her rewrite not just the past, but the future as well. As I sat in that chair where Harold used to read his business journals and plan his next ventures, I made a decision. I would not let Jessica's narrow vision become the final word on our family's story. Harold had taught me that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with force, but with patience, not with anger, but with strategic revelation of truth. Jessica thought she knew everything about me, about Harold, about the world we had inhabited together. She was about to learn how very wrong she was. But the lesson would come in my time, in my way, according to principles Harold and I had learned during our years of building something meaningful together. The truth has its own timeline, its own methods, its own power. Jessica would discover this soon enough. And when she did, she would finally understand what it really meant when someone told her that she had been living in her own world, completely blind to the reality that surrounded her. I smiled as I prepared for bed that night, thinking about Harold and how proud he would be of what I was about to do. The woman Jessica had dismissed as a delusional widow was about to remind everyone involved that appearances could be profoundly deceiving, and that the biggest mistake you could make was underestimating someone simply because they chose to live quietly. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new chances to honor Harold's memory properly. But tonight, I would rest in the knowledge that our story was far from over, and that sometimes the most powerful revelations came from the most unexpected sources. The game, as Harold used to say when he was planning his most ambitious projects, was just beginning. The call came at 7:32 on a Tuesday morning, jarring me from the peaceful quiet of my morning routine. I had been sitting at my small kitchen table, savoring my first cup of coffee while watching the sunrise paint my apartment walls golden. The phone's shrill ring cut through that serenity like a blade. "Mom!" Michael's voice was tight with panic, stripped of the careful politeness that had characterized our conversations lately. "We need to talk. Can you come over right away?" Something in his tone made my stomach clench. This wasn't about Jessica's latest complaint or another lecture about my supposed delusions. This was different, urgent, real in a way that cut through all the pretense that had built up between us. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong?" "Just, please come. I can't explain over the phone." The 20-minute bus ride to their apartment felt endless. I watched the familiar neighborhoods scroll past, each block bringing me closer to whatever crisis had stripped the composure from my son's voice. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Had someone been hurt? Was Michael sick? Had something happened to Jessica, despite our difficulties? When Michael opened the door, I hardly recognized him. My composed, successful son looked haggard, his hair uncombed, his clothes wrinkled as if he had slept in them. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion or tears, possibly both. "Michael, what on earth?" "We're losing the house," he said without preamble, the words tumbling out like a confession he could no longer contain. "Everything, the mortgage, the car payments, Jessica's credit cards. We're drowning, Mom. We're going to lose everything." I followed him into their living room, taking in the expensive furniture and decorative items that Jessica had insisted on purchasing over the past 2 years. The leather sofa that cost more than some people's monthly rent. The designer coffee table books that were never opened. The artwork chosen more for its price tag than its beauty. All of it suddenly seemed to mock us with its presence. Jessica emerged from the kitchen, her perfectly styled appearance marred by dark circles under her eyes and a tremor in her hands as she carried 2 mugs of coffee. She looked at me with something I had never seen from her before. Desperation mixed with reluctant hope. "Sharon," she said, and her voice lacked its usual condescending edge. "Michael said he was calling you." "Sit down, Mom," Michael said, gesturing to the expensive sofa. "I need to explain what's been happening." Over the next hour, the story emerged in painful fragments. Jessica's marketing firm had lost its biggest client 6 months ago, eliminating nearly 40% of their revenue overnight. Michael's architectural firm had been struggling with delayed payments from a major development project that had hit legal snags. They had been using credit cards to maintain their lifestyle, believing that their financial troubles were temporary setbacks rather than a fundamental shift in their circumstances. "We kept thinking things would turn around," Michael said, staring at his hands. "Jessica was sure she'd land another big client. I was convinced the development project would resolve its issues and pay what they owed us. We just needed to hold on a little longer." But a little longer had stretched into months, and the debt had grown like a living thing, feeding on interest and late fees until it became impossible to ignore. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage, maxed out on their credit cards, and facing foreclosure within 60 days. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. My son's pride, inherited from his father, but twisted by Jessica's influence, had prevented him from admitting the scope of their problems. "We thought we could handle it," Jessica said, and for the first time since I had known her, she sounded genuinely vulnerable. "We kept thinking, we could figure something out, find a solution that didn't involve asking for help." What she meant, I realized, was asking for help from me, the delusional old woman living in poverty who couldn't possibly have anything meaningful to offer. The irony was so sharp it was almost painful. "How much do you need?" I asked quietly. Michael and Jessica exchanged glances, and I could see the internal debate playing out between them. Finally, Michael named a figure that made even me pause. It wasn't an impossible amount, not given my actual circumstances, but it was substantial enough to represent a genuine crisis for a young couple without resources. "Mom," Michael continued, his voice heavy with shame, "I know you don't have that kind of money. I know your situation isn't. I mean, we're not expecting you to somehow solve this for us. But maybe you know someone, or maybe there's some option we haven't considered." Jessica thought maybe Harold left something, some insurance policy or investment we didn't know about. The desperate hope in his voice broke my heart. Here was my son, facing the collapse of everything he thought he had built, grasping at straws. That included the possibility that his supposedly delusional mother might have been telling the truth about his father's success after all. Jessica was watching me with a mixture of desperation and skepticism, clearly torn between her need for help and her conviction that I had nothing real to offer. I could see her calculating, wondering if perhaps there was some small inheritance she had overlooked, some modest insurance policy that might provide partial relief. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "Let me see what options might be available." "Mom, we don't have much time," Michael pressed. "The foreclosure notice gives us 60 days, but realistically, we need to come up with something in the next 2 weeks to have any chance of stopping this." "I understand the timeline," I assured him. "Give me a few days to make some inquiries." Jessica's mask slipped completely then, revealing the raw fear underneath her polished exterior. "Sharon, I know we've had our differences, but Michael is your son. Surely there's anything you can do to help us," Even a small amount would give us more time to figure out a long-term solution. The woman who had spent months dismissing my stories and questioning my mental faculties was now looking at me as a potential savior. The same person who had publicly humiliated me at Thanksgiving dinner was now pleading for my assistance. There was a bitter justice in the reversal, but it brought me no joy to see my family in genuine distress. "Jessica," I said gently, "I will do everything in my power to help you and Michael, but I need you to trust me to handle this in my own way." She nodded frantically, willing to agree to anything that might offer hope. "Of course, whatever you think is best. We're scared, Sharon. We don't know what else to do." That evening, alone in my apartment, I sat with the full weight of the decision before me. This was the moment I had been avoiding, the crossroads where my chosen simplicity would collide with my family's need. I could continue to let them believe I had limited resources, could offer what small help seemed plausible for a widow on a fixed income, and watch them struggle with a burden that was easily within my power to lift. Or I could reveal the truth about my circumstances and end this charade once and for all. But the situation was more complex than simple revelation. Jessica's treatment of me over the past 2 years hadn't just been about money or social status. It had been about fundamental respect, about the value she placed on elderly people, about her capacity for empathy and kindness. The ways she had dismissed Harold's memory, the casual cruelty with which she had treated me, the systematic poisoning of my relationship with Michael. These weren't mistakes born from ignorance. They were choices that revealed something essential about her character. Simply writing a check wouldn't address the deeper problems in our family dynamic. It might solve their immediate financial crisis, but it would leave untouched the attitudes and behaviors that had created such pain between us. Jessica needed to understand not just that she had been wrong about my circumstances, but that her treatment of me had been fundamentally unjust, regardless of my financial situation. I spent the next 3 days making careful preparations. I contacted my financial advisor, my attorney, and the property management company that oversaw my various holdings. I arranged for certain documents to be prepared, certain accounts to be made accessible, certain truths to be ready for revelation when the time was right. During those 3 days, Michael called twice, his voice increasingly strained as their deadline approached. Jessica sent me a text message, something she had never done before, asking if I had made any progress with inquiries. The desperation in their communications was palpable, and I found myself torn between sympathy for their fear and frustration at the circumstances that had created this crisis. On Thursday evening, I called Michael and asked him to come to my apartment alone. I could hear Jessica protesting in the background, demanding to know why she was being excluded from the conversation, but Michael agreed to come by himself. When he arrived, I could see that the stress was taking a physical toll on him. He had lost weight, and there was a tremor in his hands that reminded me of Harold during his most difficult business negotiations. My son was facing the potential loss of everything he thought defined his success, and the fear was consuming him. "Sit down, sweetheart," I said, guiding him to Harold's old chair. "We need to have a conversation that's long overdue. Mom, if this is about Dad's stories again, I don't think now is the time." "This is exactly about your father's stories," I interrupted, "and it's exactly the right time. Michael, what do you actually remember about our life when you were growing up?" He looked confused by the question, but he answered thoughtfully. "I remember the big house, of course, the housekeeper, the gardener, all those business trips Dad took, the fancy parties you and Dad hosted. I remember feeling like we had everything, like Dad was important and successful. And what changed your mind about those memories?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Jessica helped me understand that maybe I was remembering things as being more elaborate than they actually were. She said children often idealize their parents and their circumstances, and when you moved to this apartment after Dad died, when your lifestyle changed so dramatically, It seemed to confirm that maybe our family wasn't as wealthy as I had thought. So you decided that your own memories were false because they didn't match my current living situation? It seemed logical, he said defensively. I mean, if Dad had really been as successful as you always claimed, where did all that money go? Why would you be living like this if there was still wealth from his business ventures? I stood up and walked to my bedroom, returning with one of the boxes I had kept hidden in my closet. Michael watched curiously as I set it on the coffee table and began removing documents. Your father, I said, placing a newspaper clipping in front of him, was featured on the front page of the business section when his hotel design won the Governor's Award for Innovation in Tourism Development. Michael picked up the clipping, his eyes widening as he read his father's name in the headline, saw the photograph of Harold receiving the award from the governor himself. I placed another document in front of him. This is the contract for the sale of the Grandview Resort chain to an international hotel group. Your father's signature is at the bottom, along with the purchase price. Michael's hands shook as he read the figure, a sum that represented more money than he could earn in multiple lifetimes. Document after document followed, newspaper articles about Harold's business innovations, photographs of him with industry leaders and political figures, financial statements showing the scope of his holdings, awards and recognitions from organizations around the world. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, comprehensive. Mom, Michael whispered, staring at the papers spread across the table. These are all real. Dad really was. Everything you said he was. Every story I ever told you about your father was true, I said quietly. Every business deal, every success, every achievement. I never exaggerated or embellished anything. I simply shared my memories of the man I loved and the life we built together. But then why? Michael gestured around my modest apartment, his confusion evident. Why are you living like this? Where is all the money? What happened to Dad's empire? I sat back down, choosing my words carefully. Nothing happened to it, Michael. I still own everything your father built. The resort properties, the development company, the investment portfolio. It's all still there, still generating income, still growing in value. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the distant sound of traffic on the street below, the whisper of my own breathing. I don't understand, Michael said finally. After your father died, I made a choice, I explained. I could have continued living in the style we had established, maintaining the mansion, the servants, the social obligations. But I discovered that without Harold to share it with, that lifestyle felt empty and burdensome. I realized that some of my happiest memories were from the early days of our marriage, when we had very little money, but everything felt possible. Michael stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. So I sold the house and moved here. I gave away most of our possessions, keeping only the things that held genuine sentimental value. I began living simply, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I wanted to remember what it felt like to appreciate small pleasures, to find joy in everyday experiences, to value people for who they were rather than what they could offer me. You chose this, Michael said slowly, as if testing the words. I chose this, and I've been happier in this small apartment than I was in many of those years when we had everything money could buy. I learned that there's a difference between being rich and being wealthy, between having money and having peace. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing this revelation and what it meant for everything he thought he knew about our family, about me, about the crisis he was facing. Jessica, he said finally, she's been so wrong about everything. Jessica has been operating from her own understanding of the world, I said diplomatically. She couldn't imagine that someone might choose simplicity over luxury, so she assumed my circumstances were the result of failure rather than choice. But Mom, she's been so cruel to you. The things she's said, the way she's treated you. Michael's voice was thick with shame and anger. She's been treating you like a pathetic old woman when you're actually… When I'm actually what, Michael? He looked around my modest apartment with new eyes, seeing it not as evidence of decline, but as deliberate choice. When you're actually one of the wealthiest people I know, living exactly the way you want to live. Wealth isn't just about money, I said. It's about having choices, having the freedom to live according to your values, having the resources to help the people you love when they truly need it. Michael picked up one of the financial statements, studying the numbers that represented his father's legacy and my current holdings. Mom, you could solve our entire financial crisis without even noticing the expense. Yes, I said simply. I could. But you've been letting us suffer, letting us think we were going to lose everything. While you sat on resources that could save us, I could hear the beginning of anger in his voice, and I understood it. From his perspective, I had been withholding help while watching him and Jessica face ruin. Michael, if I had simply written you a check the first day you told me about your problems, what would you have learned? What would Jessica have learned? What would have changed about the attitudes and behaviors that created this crisis in the first place? He started to respond, then stopped, clearly thinking through the implications of what I was suggesting. Your financial problems aren't really about money, I continued. They're about choices, about priorities, about the difference between what you need and what you want. Jessica has convinced you both that your worth as people depends on maintaining a certain lifestyle, owning certain possessions, projecting a certain image. That mindset would have recreated this crisis eventually, even if I had eliminated your current debt. So, this has all been some kind of lesson? Michael asked, and I could hear both hurt and understanding in his voice. This has been life, I said. Real life, with real consequences for real choices. Jessica's treatment of me wasn't about money. It was about respect, empathy, and basic human decency. Those are qualities that can't be purchased or taught through lectures. They have to be learned through experience. Michael was quiet again, and I could see him replaying the past 2 years, viewing Jessica's behavior toward me through this new lens of understanding. She's going to be devastated when she realizes the truth, he said finally. She's going to be embarrassed, I corrected. There's a difference. Devastation implies genuine grief over real loss. Embarrassment is what you feel when you realize you've made assumptions that revealed your own limitations. Will you help us? Michael asked directly. Will you save our house, pay off our debts, give us another chance? I looked at my son, this man I had raised to be honest and kind, who had allowed someone else's influence to cloud his judgment about his own family. I will help you, Michael, but not in the way you're expecting, and not without conditions. What kind of conditions? First, you and Jessica need to have an honest conversation about how you've been living, about the choices that created this crisis, about the difference between needs and wants. Second, Jessica needs to acknowledge how she's treated me and make genuine efforts to change her behavior. And third, you both need to accept that my help will come with ongoing expectations about how you manage your finances and your relationship with me. Michael nodded slowly. That seems fair. More than fair, given how Jessica has treated you. This isn't about punishment, Michael. It's about creating a foundation for a healthier relationship going forward. I love you, and I want to help you succeed, but I won't enable behavior that's destructive to you, to Jessica, or to our family. What do we do now? He asked. Now you go home and have a conversation with your wife. Tell her what you've learned today. Help her understand not just that I have the resources to help you, but that her treatment of me was wrong, regardless of my financial circumstances. An elderly person deserves respect and kindness whether they're wealthy or poor, whether their stories are completely accurate or slightly embellished by memory and grief. Michael gathered the documents I had shown him, handling them like precious artifacts. "Can I take these to show Jessica?" "You can take copies," I said. "But Michael, the real proof won't be in those papers. It will be in how I choose to help you, and in what happens next in our relationship." After Michael left, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about the conversation that was about to take place between him and Jessica. I imagined her shock, her disbelief, her gradual realization of how completely wrong she had been about me, about Harold, about our family's history and current circumstances. But more than that, I thought about the opportunity this crisis presented, not just to solve their immediate financial problems, but to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth, respect, and mutual understanding. Jessica had revealed something important about her character through her treatment of me. But people could change if they were willing to confront their mistakes and make genuine efforts to do better. The question was whether Jessica would be capable of the kind of honest self-reflection this situation demanded, or whether her embarrassment would harden into resentment and blame. The answer would determine not just whether I helped them financially, but whether our family could move forward together or would remain fractured by pride, assumption, and the failure to see each other clearly. I had spent 2 years allowing Jessica to believe what she wanted to believe about me. Now it was time to discover what she would choose to believe about herself and about the possibility of redemption through genuine change. The next chapter of our family's story was about to begin, and for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about what it might contain. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was hollow, distant, as if he were calling from another world entirely. "Mom, we need to see you, both of us. Tonight?" "Of course," I said, though something in his tone made my chest tighten. "Is everything all right?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "I honestly don't know what all right means anymore. Jessica, she's not handling this well. The revelation about Dad, about you, about everything we thought we knew. She's been crying for 3 hours straight, and now she's just sitting on the couch staring at the wall." I had expected shock, certainly, embarrassment, without question. But the depth of Jessica's reaction suggested something more complex was happening, something that went beyond simple surprise at learning she had misjudged my circumstances. "Bring her over," I said. "We need to talk through this together." When they arrived an hour later, Jessica looked like a woman who had aged a decade in a single day. Her usually perfect makeup was gone, replaced by red-rimmed eyes and tear-stained cheeks. Her designer clothes hung on her frame as if she had shrunk inside them. Most striking of all was her posture. The confident bearing that had always defined her presence was completely absent, replaced by a defeated slump that spoke of profound disorientation. Michael guided her to my couch like she was an invalid, his protective instincts clearly activated despite whatever anger he might be feeling about her treatment of me. She sat where he placed her but didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge my presence. Her gaze remained fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance. "Jessica," I said gently, settling into the chair across from them. "Michael told me he shared what we discussed yesterday." For a moment, I thought she wouldn't respond. Then she turned to look at me directly, and the expression in her eyes was unlike anything I had ever seen from her. It wasn't anger or resentment or even embarrassment. It was something much more devastating, complete bewilderment, as if the fundamental laws of her universe had suddenly stopped working. "I don't understand," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't understand any of this. Why would you live like this if you didn't have to? Why would you let me say those things to you, think those things about you, if you knew they weren't true?" Michael shifted uncomfortably beside her. I could see him struggling with his own guilt about the role he had played in enabling Jessica's behavior, the way he had gradually started to doubt his own memories of his father based on her skepticism. "Jessica," I said carefully, Can you help me understand what specifically is troubling you most about what you've learned? She stared at me for a long moment, then stood abruptly and began pacing my small living room like a caged animal. What's troubling me? What's troubling me is that everything I thought I knew about you, about myself, about how the world works, was completely wrong. I've spent 2 years treating you like a pathetic old woman living in delusions, and it turns out you're wealthier than anyone I've ever met in my entire life. Does that change how you feel about the way you treated me? I asked. The question stopped her mid-pace. She whirled to face me, her composure finally cracking completely. Of course it changes everything. If I had known who you really were, I never would have said those things, never would have dismissed your stories, never would have. Never would have what? Never would have been so cruel, she finished, the words coming out in a rush of tears she could no longer contain. I let the silence settle around us before responding. Jessica, I need you to think carefully about what you just said. You're telling me that you regret your behavior because you discovered I'm wealthy. But what if I hadn't been? What if I really had been the poor, delusional widow you thought I was? Would your treatment of me have been acceptable then? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling with the implications of the question. Because here's what troubles me, I continued. Your regret seems to be based on your misjudgment of my status, not on the fundamental cruelty of your actions. You're embarrassed that you were wrong about my circumstances, but are you ashamed of how you treated an elderly woman regardless of those circumstances? Michael leaned forward in his seat. Mom, I think what Jessica is trying to say— No, Jessica interrupted, her voice stronger now. No, she's right. Sharon is absolutely right. She sat back down heavily, her hands shaking as she wiped tears from her cheeks. I'm sitting here feeling sorry for myself because I made a mistake about your financial situation, but that's not the real problem. Is it? What do you think the real problem is? I asked. The real problem is that I treated you terribly because I thought you were beneath me. I dismissed your stories because I decided you were just a sad old woman living in fantasies. I mocked your clothes, your apartment, your lifestyle, because I thought they made you lesser than me. And if you really had been poor, if you really had been struggling, that would have made my behavior worse, not better. It was the first moment of genuine insight Jessica had shown since I had known her, and it gave me a flicker of hope that this crisis might actually lead to real growth, rather than just surface changes. You're beginning to understand, I said. The question now is what you plan to do with that understanding. Jessica was quiet for several minutes, staring at her hands while Michael watched her with an expression of mixed concern and expectation. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted. I don't know how to undo 2 years of being exactly the kind of person I always said I hated. My own mother was dismissed and belittled by people who thought they were better than her because she cleaned houses for a living. I swore I would never treat anyone the way those people treated her. And then I did exactly that to you. This revelation about Jessica's background surprised me. She had never mentioned her mother's work before, had never given any indication that she understood what it felt like to be looked down upon by others. The irony was profound and heartbreaking. Tell me about your mother, I said gently. She worked 3 jobs to put me through college, Jessica said, fresh tears beginning to flow. She cleaned offices at night, houses on weekends, and worked at a diner during the day. She never complained, never made excuses, never acted like the work was beneath her dignity. But I saw how other people treated her. I saw how they looked at her hands, rough from cleaning supplies. I heard how they talked to her, like she was stupid or worthless just because she did physical labor. Michael reached over and took her hand, clearly hearing this story for the first time as well. I promised myself that when I was successful, when I had money and education and status, I would never make anyone feel the way those people made my mother feel. I would never judge someone based on their circumstances or assume I was better than them because of what I had achieved. But that's exactly what you did to me, I said, not unkindly. That's exactly what I did to you, she agreed, her voice breaking. I became the worst version of the people I despised. I looked at your apartment, your clothes, your simple lifestyle, and I decided you were pathetic. I listened to your stories about Harold and decided they were delusions because they didn't match what I thought your life should look like. I treated you with the same dismissive cruelty that broke my mother's heart over and over again. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Jessica's quiet crying. I could see Michael processing this new information about his wife's background, understanding for the first time some of the drives and insecurities that had shaped her behavior. "Jessica," I said finally, "why didn't you tell us about your mother before? About your background?" She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Because I was ashamed. Because I wanted to pretend that I had always belonged in the world I was trying to create for myself and Michael. I thought if people knew where I came from, they would treat me the way my mother was treated. So I created this persona, this perfect image of someone who had always had money and sophistication and taste. And maintaining that image became more important than maintaining your values," I observed. "Yes," she whispered. "Somewhere along the way, I started believing my own performance. I started thinking that having money and nice things really did make me better than people who didn't have those things. I forgot that my mother was the strongest, kindest, most dignified person I've ever known, and she never owned anything more expensive than the uniform she wore to work." Michael spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Jessica, why didn't you ever tell me any of this? About your mother, about how you grew up, about why success mattered so much to you?" "Because I was afraid you wouldn't love me if you knew the truth about where I came from," she said, looking at him with desperate honesty. "Your family had money, education, opportunities that mine never had. I thought I needed to pretend I belonged in your world to deserve a place in it. But I fell in love with you," Michael said, his voice gentle but firm. "Not with some image you created. If you had told me about your mother, about your struggles, about what drove you to succeed, I would have loved you more, not less. That's who you really are. Someone who overcame difficult circumstances to build a better life. That's something to be proud of, not ashamed of." Jessica turned to me then, her face streaked with tears but her eyes clearer than I had ever seen them. "Sharon, I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give. I owe you an explanation that doesn't excuse anything I've done, and I owe you a debt that I'll never be able to repay." "What kind of debt?" I asked. "You could have humiliated me," she said. "When I made those horrible comments at Thanksgiving dinner, when I talked about your delusions in front of other people, when I suggested you needed professional help for your grip on reality. You could have pulled out those documents right then and there and made me look like the fool I was. But you didn't." "No, I didn't. Do you understand why?" Jessica thought for a moment. "Because humiliating me wouldn't have taught me anything. It would have just made me angry and defensive. You needed me to come to this understanding on my own to see the full scope of my behavior and recognize it for what it was." "Partly," I agreed. "But also because public humiliation isn't justice, Jessica. It's just another form of cruelty. I didn't want to hurt you the way you had hurt me. I wanted you to understand why your behavior was wrong so you could choose to change it. But I did hurt you," she said, and her voice was thick with guilt. "Those things I said, the way I treated you, the way I convinced Michael to doubt his own memories of his father. I caused real damage to real relationships." "Yes, you did," I acknowledged. "The question is what you plan to do about that now." Jessica stood up again, but this time her movement was purposeful rather than agitated. She walked to the window that looked out over my small balcony garden, where I grew tomatoes and herbs in containers I had purchased at a discount store. "I need to make amends," she said. "Real amends, not just apologies. I need to find ways to repair the damage I've done and prove that I can be better than I've been." "What does that look like to you?" I asked. She turned back to face me, and I could see something new in her expression. Not the confident mask she usually wore, but a tentative hope mixed with genuine determination. "It means acknowledging publicly that I was wrong about you, that your stories about Harold were true, that my skepticism was based on my own prejudices rather than any evidence," she said. "It means apologizing to the people who heard me dismiss you as delusional and making sure they understand that I was the one who was out of touch with reality." Michael looked surprised. "Jessica, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "I made those comments in public, so my correction needs to be public too. But more than that," she continued, turning back to me, "it means changing how I think about money, about status, about what makes someone worthy of respect. It means learning to live differently, to value different things, to be the kind of person my mother raised me to be instead of the kind of person I thought I needed to become." "And what about your current financial crisis?" I asked. Jessica and Michael exchanged glances, and I could see them both grappling with the complexity of their situation. They needed help desperately, but the context in which that help would be given had changed completely. "I don't know," Jessica said honestly. "I know you have the resources to help us, and I know we need that help to keep our house. But I also know that I have no right to ask for it after how I've treated you. And more than that, I'm starting to understand that the choices that got us into this crisis are connected to the same attitude problems that made me treat you so badly." "How so?" "We've been living like having expensive things was more important than being financially responsible," she said. "We bought furniture we couldn't afford, clothes we didn't need, went to restaurants and events that we knew were beyond our budget, all because I thought maintaining a certain image was crucial to our success and happiness." Michael nodded, reluctantly. "Jessica's right. We got so caught up in looking successful that we forgot to actually be successful. We prioritized appearance over substance, just like—" He trailed off, clearly realizing the parallel. "Just like I prioritized my assumptions about Sharon's appearance over the substance of who she actually was," Jessica finished. "So what do you want to do now?" I asked them both. "We want to accept responsibility for our mistakes," Michael said. "Both our financial mistakes and our mistakes in how we've treated you. We want to learn to live differently, to make better choices, to be better people. And we want to ask for your help," Jessica added. "But only if you think we've genuinely learned from this experience and only if you believe we can change." I looked at these two young people, my son and the woman he loved, both of them humbled by circumstances that had stripped away their illusions about themselves and their world. They were facing the loss of everything they thought defined their success. But for the first time since I had known Jessica, I saw the possibility of them gaining something much more valuable. "I'm willing to help you," I said, "but not in the way you might expect." They waited for me to continue, both of them clearly prepared to accept whatever conditions I might impose. "I'm not going to simply pay off your debts and restore your previous lifestyle," I explained. "That would just recreate the same problems that got you into this situation. Instead, I'm going to help you build something sustainable, something based on genuine financial responsibility and authentic values." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" Michael asked. "It means we're going to restructure your entire approach to money and possessions," I said. "I'll help you avoid foreclosure, but you're going to downsize to a home you can actually afford on your real income. I'll help you eliminate your debt, but you're going to learn to live within your means without relying on credit cards to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle." Jessica was nodding as I spoke, clearly understanding that what I was offering was not a return to their old life, but an opportunity to build a better one. And most importantly, I continued, you're going to learn to find satisfaction and identity in who you are rather than what you own. You're going to discover what I learned after Harold died, that true wealth comes from living according to your values, not from accumulating possessions that impress other people. It sounds like you're offering us a chance to start over, Jessica said. I'm offering you a chance to start authentically, I corrected, to build a life that reflects your real priorities instead of the priorities you thought you were supposed to have. Michael leaned back against the couch, looking both relieved and overwhelmed. Mom, this is incredibly generous. More generous than we deserve after everything that's happened. This isn't about what you deserve, I said. This is about what's possible when people are willing to face the truth about themselves and make genuine changes. Jessica, you've acknowledged the harm you've caused and shown real insight into why you caused it. That's the beginning of wisdom. Michael, you've supported your wife through this difficult realization while also holding her accountable for her actions. That's the beginning of true partnership. What happens now? Jessica asked. Now we start the practical work of rebuilding your financial foundation, I said. But first, there's something else we need to address. They both looked at me expectantly, clearly wondering what other revelations might be coming. Tomorrow morning, I need to make a trip to check on some property that requires regular maintenance, I said casually. I'd like both of you to come with me. It's time you understood the full scope of what Harold built and what I've been managing all these years. Property? Michael asked, clearly confused. Harold's legacy didn't end with his death, I explained. It grew. The business empire he created has continued to expand and evolve. Tomorrow, you'll see what that really means, and you'll begin to understand the responsibilities that come with the kind of wealth you'll eventually inherit. Jessica's eyes widened. Inherit? Did you think I was going to take it all with me when I die? I asked with a slight smile. Michael is Harold's son, and you're Michael's wife. Eventually, this will all be yours to manage and pass on to your own children. But first, you need to prove that you can handle it responsibly, that you understand the difference between having money and being wise about money. The room fell silent as the full implications of what I was saying sank in. They had come to me seeking help with their immediate crisis, but they were discovering that their problems and their opportunities were much larger than they had imagined. Sharon, Jessica said softly, why are you giving us this chance? After everything I've done, why are you still willing to trust us with such enormous responsibility? I thought about Harold, about the conversations we used to have about legacy and family, about the importance of second chances and the power of redemption. I thought about Jessica's mother, working 3 jobs to give her daughter opportunities she had never had. I thought about the young woman Jessica had been before success and status had hardened her heart, and the woman she might become if given the chance to remember her authentic values. Because everyone deserves the opportunity to become their best self, I said finally. Because mistakes don't have to define us if we're willing to learn from them. And because I believe that underneath all the fears and pretenses and defensive behaviors, you're both good people who can do meaningful things with the resources you'll eventually be given. Jessica began crying again, but these tears were different from the earlier ones. These were tears of gratitude and relief, mixed with the overwhelming realization of how much work lay ahead. We won't disappoint you, she said through her tears. I promise we won't disappoint you. Don't make promises to me, I said gently. Make commitments to yourselves. Promise yourselves that you'll live with integrity, that you'll treat others with respect regardless of their circumstances, that you'll use whatever resources you're given to make the world a little better than you found it. As they prepared to leave that evening, Jessica turned to me one more time. Sharon, will you tell me about your mother-in-law? About Harold's mother? I realize I never asked about his family, about the people who shaped him into the man who could build what he built. I smiled, touched by her interest, and recognizing it as a sign of genuine change. Harold's mother was a schoolteacher who believed that education was the greatest gift you could give someone. She taught him that success meant using your abilities to solve problems for other people, not just to accumulate wealth for yourself. She would have liked you, Jessica, especially after today. Why? Because she believed that the most beautiful thing about people was their capacity to learn, to grow, to become better than they were yesterday. She would have seen today as proof that you possess that capacity. After they left, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about the conversation we would have tomorrow, when they saw the full scope of Harold's empire and began to understand what their future might hold. They would be shocked again, certainly, but hopefully this time the shock would be tempered by wisdom, by humility, by a newfound appreciation for the responsibilities that came with great resources. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was my property manager, calling with the routine weekly update on the resort operations and maintenance schedules. "Mrs. Butler," he said, "the helicopter will be ready for your inspection trip tomorrow morning. Will you be traveling alone, or should we prepare for additional passengers?" I looked out my window at the city lights twinkling in the darkness, thinking about Jessica's tears of recognition and Michael's dawning understanding of the future that awaited them. "Prepare for 2 additional passengers," I said. "We have a family business to discuss." The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn as we drove to the small airfield 30 minutes outside the city. Jessica sat in the passenger seat of Michael's car, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while I watched the familiar landscape roll past from the back seat. Neither of them had spoken much during the drive, both lost in their own thoughts about what the day might reveal. I had deliberately kept the details vague when I suggested this trip. Property maintenance could mean anything from checking on a rental house to inspecting a small office building. I could see Jessica glancing back at me occasionally, clearly trying to reconcile my modest appearance with the growing evidence that my resources extended far beyond anything she had imagined. When we pulled through the gates of Millfield Executive Airport, Michael's confusion was evident in his voice. "Mom, are we picking someone up? Meeting a client here?" "Not exactly," I said, gathering my simple canvas purse and the thermos of coffee I had prepared for the journey. "We're taking a short flight to the property that needs attention." Jessica turned completely around in her seat to stare at me. "A flight? Sharon, I don't understand. Where exactly are we going?" Before I could answer, a figure in a crisp white uniform approached our car. Captain Rodriguez had been Harold's pilot for the last 10 years of his life and had continued, managing our aviation needs after Harold's death. He opened my door with the same professional courtesy he had always shown, completely unfazed by my simple clothing or modest demeanor. "Good morning, Mrs. Butler," he said warmly. "Beautiful day for flying. The weather reports show clear skies, all the way to the island." I watched Jessica's face as the word island registered. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Michael got out of the car slowly, looking around the executive airport with dawning comprehension. "Captain Rodriguez," I said, stepping out of the car with the dignity that came naturally after decades of moving in Harold's business world. "I'd like you to meet my son, Michael, and his wife, Jessica. They'll be joining us today." "Delighted to meet you both," the captain said, shaking their hands with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Butler speaks of you often. Shall we proceed to the aircraft? The flight time will be approximately 45 minutes. Jessica found her voice as we walked across the tarmac toward the helicopter. "Sharon, when you said property maintenance, I thought you meant checking on a rental house or something. You own an island?" "Harold bought it in 1987, I explained, watching her process this information. "It was a failed resort development that the previous owners couldn't make profitable. Harold saw potential that others had missed." Michael stopped walking entirely. "Dad bought an island? A whole island? And you never mentioned this? I mentioned it many times, I said gently. Every story I told about Harold's resort development projects included references to the island property. You both assumed I was exaggerating or confused about the details. The helicopter sat gleaming in the morning sunlight, its corporate logo still bearing Harold's company insignia. As Captain Rodriguez performed his pre-flight checks, I could see Jessica and Michael standing frozen beside the aircraft, both of them struggling to integrate this new reality with everything they thought they knew about our family. "Mrs. Butler," Jessica said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the warming engines. "How big is this island?" "Sapphire Key covers approximately 230 acres, I replied matter-of-factly. Harold transformed it into a luxury eco-resort that consistently ranks among the top destination properties in the Caribbean. The development includes 48 private villas, a main lodge, 3 restaurants, a spa facility, and a championship golf course designed by Tom Morrison. Michael sat down heavily on a nearby bench, his face pale with shock. "Mom, you're describing a multi-million-dollar operation." "Multi-hundred-million-dollar," I corrected. "The property's current market valuation, including the business operations and projected revenue streams, is just over $800 million. But Harold never intended to sell it. He built it as a legacy property, something that would continue generating income and employment for generations." Jessica's legs seemed to give out beneath her. She sank down next to Michael, staring at me with an expression of complete disbelief. $800 million? Sharon, are you telling me that you personally own a resort worth $800 million? "I own several properties," I said, settling beside them on the bench. "The island is the largest single asset, but Harold's portfolio included hotel developments across 3 continents. After his death, I consolidated some of the holdings and sold others, but the core properties continue to operate and grow." Captain Rodriguez approached us, clearly accustomed to passengers needing a few moments to process their first visit to the island. "We're ready for departure whenever you are, Mrs. Butler. Should I delay the flight?" "Give us a few more minutes." "Captain," I said, "my family is adjusting to some new information." Michael looked up at me with eyes that held a mixture of awe and something approaching fear. "Mom, when you said you could help us with our financial problems, you weren't talking about a few $1,000s or even $100,000. You were talking about resources that could solve our problems without you even noticing the expense." "That's correct," I acknowledged. "And when you've been living in that small apartment, shopping at thrift stores, taking the bus everywhere, you've been doing that by choice, not necessity." "Also correct." Jessica stood up abruptly and began pacing in small circles beside the helicopter. "I can't process this," she said, her voice rising with hysteria. "I can't wrap my mind around what this means. Sharon, you could buy our house, our neighborhood, probably our entire subdivision, with what amounts to pocket change for you." "Material wealth is just numbers on financial statements," I said. "It doesn't change who I am or how I choose to live. It doesn't make me more important or more valuable as a person. It simply provides options and responsibilities." "But it changes everything about how I've treated you," Jessica said, stopping her pacing to face me directly. "Every dismissive comment, every condescending remark, every time I suggested you were living in fantasies, I was insulting someone who could have bought and sold everything I've ever owned 1,000 times over." "Jessica," I said firmly, "your treatment of me was wrong whether I owned an island or lived in a cardboard box. My financial circumstances don't determine my worth as a human being, and they shouldn't determine how others treat me. The fact that you're focusing on my wealth rather than my inherent dignity suggests you still don't understand the real lesson here." Michael put his arm around Jessica as she began crying again, the weight of her realizations clearly overwhelming her, emotional capacity to process them. "She's right, Jess. The money doesn't matter. What matters is that Mom deserved respect and kindness regardless of what she owned. I know, Jessica sobbed. I know that intellectually, but emotionally I'm drowning in the magnitude of how wrong I was about everything. And now, we're about to fly to her private island resort, and I'm going to see exactly how wealthy she really is, and it's going to make my behavior seem even more horrible than it already was. I stood up and placed my hands on Jessica's shoulders, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. Jessica, listen to me carefully. We're not going to the island so you can torture yourself with guilt about your past behavior. We're going so you can understand the responsibilities and opportunities that come with the wealth you and Michael will eventually inherit. We're going so you can see what Harold built and begin to understand how to carry it forward. Inherit? Michael repeated, clearly still struggling with the implications. Mom, are you saying… I'm saying that someday, probably sooner than any of us would prefer, you're going to be responsible for managing assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You're going to make decisions that affect the livelihoods of hundreds of employees. You're going to have the power to make significant impacts on the communities where these properties operate. Today is the beginning of your education in what that responsibility looks like. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat politely. Mrs. Butler, if we don't depart soon, we'll miss our optimal weather window. The afternoon thunderstorms are building earlier than usual today. Of course, I said, helping Jessica to her feet. Are you ready for this? Jessica wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. I don't think anyone could be ready for this. But yes, I want to see it. I want to understand what Harold created and what you've been managing all these years. The helicopter ride passed in relative silence, with Michael and Jessica pressed against the windows watching the landscape transform from suburban sprawl to rural farmland to endless blue ocean. I had made this journey hundreds of times over. The years. But seeing it through their eyes reminded me of my own first flight to the island with Harold, back when it was nothing but overgrown vegetation and the remnants of failed development. When Sapphire Key appeared on the horizon, I heard Jessica gasp audibly. Even from a distance, the island was breathtaking. The emerald green of carefully maintained tropical landscaping contrasted with the pristine white sand beaches and crystal-clear turquoise waters. The resort buildings, designed to blend seamlessly with the natural environment, were barely visible through the lush vegetation until you were directly overhead. My God, Michael whispered. It's like something from a movie. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the headphones we all wore. Mrs. Butler, shall I take us on the scenic route or proceed directly to the landing pad? Let's give them the full tour, I said, watching my family's faces as we circled the island. From the air, the scope of Harold's vision was clearly visible. The golf course flowed across the island's rolling terrain like a green carpet, with water features and sand traps positioned to take advantage of the natural topography. The villa accommodations were scattered throughout the tropical gardens, each one positioned for maximum privacy while maintaining access to the common areas and beaches. The main lodge rose from the highest point on the island, its architecture, inspired by traditional Caribbean design, but scaled to accommodate large gatherings and events. The spa facility was built into a natural valley, with treatment rooms that opened directly onto private gardens and meditation areas. The marina held several dozen boats, from small sailing vessels to luxury yachts, with a dive shop and water sports center clearly visible from our aerial vantage point. How many people work here? Jessica asked through the headphones. During peak season, we employ about 350 people, I replied. About 60% of them live on the island year-round, in the staff village that you can't see from this angle. Harold insisted on providing quality housing, healthcare, and education for employees and their families. The island has its own school, medical clinic, and community center. It's like a small town, Michael observed. That was Harold's intention. He wanted to create a sustainable community, not just a business operation. The resort provides employment and economic stability for families who might otherwise have to leave their home islands to find work. It's profitable, but profit was never the only goal. As we descended toward the landing pad, I could see resort staff gathering to welcome us. The island's general manager, Maria Santos, had been with the property for 15 years and managed day-to-day operations with the same attention to detail that Harold had demanded. Several department heads were also present, along with the maintenance supervisors who would be accompanying us on today's inspection. When the helicopter touched down and the engines wound down to silence, Jessica and Michael climbed out slowly, still clearly overwhelmed by what they were seeing. The tropical air was warm and humid, filled with the scent of flowering plants and the distant sound of waves on the beach. "Mrs. Butler," Maria said, approaching with genuine warmth and the easy confidence of someone who ran a world-class operation. "Welcome back to Sapphire Key. I hope your flight was comfortable." "Perfectly smooth as always," I replied, accepting her welcoming embrace. "Maria, I'd like you to meet my son Michael and his wife Jessica. They're here to learn about the property and begin understanding the business operations." Maria's smile broadened as she shook hands with Michael and Jessica. "How wonderful to finally meet you both. Mrs. Butler speaks of you often, and we've all been hoping you would visit. The entire staff is excited to show you what we've built here." As we walked from the landing pad toward the main lodge, I could see Jessica and Michael trying to absorb the scale and quality of everything around them. The pathways were made from natural stone, bordered by tropical plants that had been carefully selected for their beauty and their ability to thrive in the island environment. Small streams and waterfalls created a soothing soundtrack, while colorful birds flitted through the trees overhead. "The landscaping alone must have cost millions," Michael said quietly. "Harold hired the same firm that designed the gardens at several world-renowned resorts," I explained. "But he insisted on using native plants whenever possible and creating habitats that would support local wildlife. The island is now home to several species that had disappeared from this region." The main lodge's interior was even more impressive than its exterior. The open-air design allowed tropical breezes to flow through the space, while ceiling fans provided additional comfort during the warmest parts of the day. The furniture was handcrafted by local artisans, and the artwork displayed throughout the lodge showcased the talents of Caribbean artists. "Would you like to begin with a tour of the public areas, or would you prefer to see the operational facilities first?" Maria asked. "Let's start with the business side," I said. "Michael and Jessica need to understand how this property functions as an enterprise, not just as a beautiful destination." Over the next 3 hours, we toured every aspect of the resort's operations. We visited the commercial kitchen that could prepare meals for up to 500 guests simultaneously, staffed by chefs trained at culinary institutes around the world. We saw the housekeeping facilities that maintained standards of cleanliness and luxury that consistently earned the resort 5-star ratings from travel publications. The spa facility included treatment rooms equipped with the latest wellness technology, along with natural healing gardens where guests could participate in yoga classes or meditation sessions. The golf course maintenance facility housed equipment, worth more than most people's homes, operated by a grounds crew that kept the course in tournament-ready condition year-round. The guest satisfaction ratings are consistently above 95%, Maria explained as we reviewed the latest performance reports. "We maintain a waiting list for accommodations that extends 18 months in advance for our peak seasons." Jessica had been quiet for most of the tour, clearly struggling to process the scope of what she was seeing. Finally, as we stood on the terrace of the main lodge looking out over the resort grounds, she found her voice. "Sharon, this isn't just a business. This is like a small kingdom. You don't just own this place. You're responsible for all these people, all these families, who depend on this resort for their livelihoods." "That's exactly right," I said. "And that's why I needed you both to see it. Wealth isn't just about having money in the bank. It's about stewardship, about using resources responsibly, about understanding that your decisions affect real people's lives." Michael was studying the financial reports that Maria had provided. Mom, according to these numbers, this single property generates more annual revenue than most Fortune 500 companies. And you're telling me there are other properties? 6. Other major holdings, I confirmed. 2 hotel chains in Europe, a resort development in Costa Rica, commercial properties in 3 major cities, and a portfolio of smaller investments. Harold built this empire over 30 years, and I've spent the last 5 years learning to manage it effectively. Learning to manage it? Jessica asked. You mean you didn't know how to run businesses like this when Harold died? I knew some things from being involved in Harold's decision-making process, but I had to develop many new skills, I admitted. I hired the best advisors, took business courses, traveled to every property to understand their operations personally. It was like getting a graduate degree in hotel management, finance, and international business all at the same time. But why? Michael asked. You could have hired managers to run everything. You could have just collected the profits and lived however you wanted. Because Harold didn't build this empire just to generate passive income, I explained. He built it to create something meaningful, something that would continue to grow and evolve and serve people long after he was gone. I couldn't honor his legacy by simply turning it over to hired managers and walking away. Maria nodded in agreement. Mrs. Butler visits every property at least twice a year. She knows our staff members by name, understands our challenges, and makes decisions based on what's best for the long-term health of the business and the communities we serve. She's not an absentee owner. She's an active partner in everything we do. As the afternoon wore on, we toured the guest accommodations, each villa more luxurious than the last. The presidential suite where heads of state and celebrities stayed during their visits featured a private beach, infinity pool, and personal staff quarters. The standard guest villas offered amenities that surpassed those of most 5-star hotels, with handcrafted furniture, marble bathrooms, and private terraces overlooking the ocean. Each villa is individually decorated, Maria explained as we toured one of the oceanfront accommodations. Mrs. Butler personally approved every design element, ensuring that guests feel like they're staying in a private home rather than a hotel room. Jessica ran her fingers along the custom woodwork of the villa's dining table. Sharon, how do you make decisions about things like this? How do you know what will create the right experience for guests? I spend time in every accommodation. Myself, I said. I sleep in the beds, use the bathrooms, sit on the terraces at different times of day. I try to experience what guests will experience, so I can identify anything that might need improvement. You do that for every villa? Every room in every property you own? How else would I know if we're providing value for what we charge? I asked. Guests pay premium prices for these accommodations because they expect premium experiences. My job is to ensure they get what they pay for. Michael shook his head in amazement. Mom, you've been running a hospitality empire while living in a 1-bedroom apartment and shopping at thrift stores. The contrast is incredible. There's no contrast, I said. Both lifestyles reflect my values. I live simply at home because that brings me peace and satisfaction. I maintain luxury standards at these properties because that's what our guests expect and deserve. Different situations require different approaches. As evening approached, Maria invited us to dine at the resort's flagship restaurant, where the executive chef prepared a tasting menu featuring ingredients grown on the island's organic farm. Jessica and Michael ate in virtual silence, clearly overwhelmed by the day's revelations and still processing the implications of what they had seen. Mrs. Butler, Maria said over coffee and dessert, have you given any thought to the management? Transition plans we discussed last quarter? The department heads are eager to begin preparing for the next generation of leadership. I looked at Michael and Jessica, both of whom were staring at me with expressions of barely controlled panic. We're in the early stages of that conversation, I said diplomatically. Michael and Jessica are just beginning to understand the scope of their future responsibilities. Future responsibilities? Jessica repeated weakly. Did you think I was going to leave all of this to charity? I asked gently. Michael is Harold's son, and you're part of our family now. Someday, probably in the next 10 to 15 years, you're going to need to decide how you want to carry Harold's legacy forward. Michael leaned back in his chair, looking overwhelmed. Mom, I'm an architect. I design office buildings and shopping centers. I don't know anything about running resort properties or managing international business operations. Harold was a civil engineer when he bought his first failing hotel, I reminded him. He learned by doing, by making mistakes, by surrounding himself with good people and listening to their advice. The skills can be learned. The question is whether you have the character and values necessary to do this work well. What do you mean? Jessica asked. Running businesses like these requires making decisions that affect hundreds of people's lives, I explained. You have to balance profit with responsibility, growth with sustainability, efficiency with compassion. You have to understand that being wealthy means being accountable, not just being comfortable. The conversation continued as we walked along the moonlit beach after dinner. The sound of gentle waves and the rustle of palm fronds created a peaceful backdrop for discussions about legacy, responsibility, and the future of Harold's empire. I keep thinking about my mother, Jessica said as we paused to watch the stars, reflecting on the dark water. She would never have believed that her daughter would someday be responsible for something like this. She cleaned other people's hotel rooms, and now I'm supposed to own the hotels. Your mother would be proud of how far you've come, I said. But more importantly, she would want you to remember the values she taught you about hard work, treating people fairly, and using whatever advantages you have to help others. How do I possibly prepare for something like this? She asked. How do I learn to make decisions that affect so many people's lives? The same way I did, I replied. You start by learning about the business, understanding the operations, getting to know the people who work in these properties. You make mistakes, but you learn from them. You surround yourself with experienced advisors, but you make sure the final decisions reflect your own values and judgment. Michael picked up a handful of sand and let it run through his fingers. Mom, this changes everything about our financial crisis, doesn't it? Our mortgage problems, our credit card debt, the threat of foreclosure, all of that is completely insignificant compared to what you're showing us today. The money problems are insignificant, I agreed. But the character issues that created those problems are not. Learning to manage personal finances responsibly is essential preparation for managing business finances responsibly. If you can't control your spending on credit cards, how can I trust you to make budget decisions for properties that employ hundreds of people? So our financial crisis was actually a test? Jessica asked. It was an opportunity, I corrected. An opportunity to learn important lessons about money, priorities, and personal responsibility. An opportunity to discover whether you were capable of genuine change when faced with real consequences for your choices. As we walked back toward the main lodge, where we would spend the night in the owner's suite, Jessica stopped suddenly and turned to face me. Sharon, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Are you doing all of this, showing us the island, talking about inheritance, offering to help with our debts? Are you doing it because you forgive me for how I treated you, or because you think it's what Harold would have wanted, or because you feel obligated to take care of Michael regardless of how his wife behaved? It was a perceptive question, one that went to the heart of my motivations and Jessica's own guilt about accepting help from someone she had treated so poorly. I'm doing it because I believe in second chances, I said. I'm doing it because I've seen you recognize your mistakes and show genuine remorse for the harm you caused. I'm doing it because I think you and Michael have the potential to carry Harold's legacy forward in ways that would make him proud. But also, she pressed, clearly sensing there was more to my answer. But also because I've learned something important about forgiveness over the past few days, I admitted. Forgiveness isn't just about letting go of anger or resentment. It's about creating space for people to become better than they've been. You can't undo the things you said to me, but you can choose to be someone who would never say those things again. That possibility is worth investing in. Jessica began crying again, but these tears were different from the ones she had shed over the past few days. These were tears of gratitude, relief, and perhaps most importantly, hope. "I won't let you down," she whispered. "I won't let Harold's memory down. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in me wasn't misplaced." "Don't make promises you can't keep," I said gently. "Just commit to doing better each day than you did the day before. That's all any of us can do." As we prepared to retire for the evening, Michael and Jessica stood on the terrace of the owner's suite, looking out over the resort that would someday be their responsibility to manage. The weight of that future was clearly visible in their postures, but so was something else. A new sense of purpose, a growing understanding of what it meant to have resources that could make a real difference in the world. Tomorrow, we would fly back to their small apartment and begin the practical work of restructuring their finances and their lives. But tonight, on this island that Harold had transformed from a failed development into a thriving community, they were beginning to understand what it really meant to inherit not just wealth, but wisdom, responsibility, and the opportunity to continue building something meaningful. The final test would come when they returned to their regular lives, when the immediate crisis was resolved and they had to prove that the lessons learned here would translate into lasting change. But for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I felt confident that they were ready for that challenge. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of Michael and Jessica's new home, a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets and neighbors knew each other's names. The contrast with their previous apartment couldn't have been more stark, and the change reflected far more than just a different address. Jessica was at the stove preparing dinner, her movements confident and relaxed in a way I had never seen before. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and there wasn't a designer label in sight. But what struck me most was her face, open, genuine, at peace with herself in a way that all the expensive clothes and perfect makeup had never achieved. "Sharon, could you help me with the salad?" she asked, glancing over with a smile that reached her eyes. "Michael should be home any minute, and I want everything ready when he gets here." I joined her at the counter, noting how she had arranged fresh vegetables from the farmer's market we had visited together that morning. It had become one of our weekly traditions, this Saturday routine of shopping for ingredients and preparing meals together. Simple pleasures that Jessica had discovered brought her more satisfaction than any expensive restaurant ever had. "How did the meeting go with the financial advisor?" I asked as we worked side by side. "Better than I hoped," Jessica replied, her voice filled with quiet pride. "We're actually ahead of schedule on paying down the remaining debt. Michael's new position at the sustainable architecture firm is working out wonderfully, and my freelance marketing work is bringing in steady income without the stress of managing a large agency. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. After our return from the island, Michael and Jessica had needed months to fully process what they had learned and what it meant for their future. There had been difficult conversations, moments of overwhelming anxiety about their eventual responsibilities, and the challenging work of rebuilding their relationship with money and possessions. But they had approached the process with genuine commitment to change. They had sold their expensive furniture and bought comfortable, practical pieces from local artisans. They had traded their luxury cars for reliable, efficient vehicles. Most importantly, they had learned to find joy in experiences rather than acquisitions, in relationships rather than status symbols. "And how are you feeling about the board meeting next month?" I asked, referring to Jessica's first official introduction to the directors of Harold's hospitality empire. Jessica paused in her chopping, considering the question carefully. Nervous, but excited, she said finally. I've been reading everything I can about sustainable tourism and community development. I have so many ideas about ways we could expand the educational programs at the resorts, maybe create scholarship opportunities for local students. This was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. Jessica had thrown herself into understanding the businesses she would someday help manage, but her focus wasn't on maximizing profits or expanding operations. Instead, she was passionate about the social impact these properties could have, the ways they could contribute to the communities where they operated. Your mother would be proud, I said quietly. Jessica's hands stilled completely, and I saw tears gather in her eyes. I think about her every day now, about how hard she worked, how she never complained, how she always treated people with dignity even when they didn't treat her the same way. I want to honor her memory by using whatever opportunities I'm given to help people the way she helped our family. The front door opened, and Michael's voice called out from the entryway. Something smells incredible in here. He appeared, in the kitchen doorway, loosening his tie with the easy satisfaction of someone who had spent the day doing work that mattered to him. His new job designing affordable housing and community centers paid less than his previous position, but the fulfillment it provided was evident in everything from his posture to his smile. "How was your day?" Jessica asked, rising on her toes, to kiss him hello in a gesture that spoke of genuine affection rather than performance. "Challenging and wonderful," Michael replied, wrapping his arms around her. "We got approval for the community center project in the downtown district. It's going to provide after-school programs, job training, and health services for families who really need them." This was Michael's passion project, something he had never had time to pursue when he was focused on designing luxury developments for wealthy clients. The community center would be built using sustainable materials and energy-efficient systems, serving as a model for future projects that prioritized social impact over profit margins. "Mom, thank you for coming over," Michael said, turning to embrace me. "I know Saturday dinners have become a tradition, but I don't want you to feel obligated." "I look forward to these evenings all week," I interrupted. "Watching you both discover what truly makes you happy has been one of the greatest joys of my life." As we sat down to dinner around their simple wooden table, I marveled at how different these gatherings were from the tense, formal meals we used to share in their expensive apartment. Conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and genuine interest in each other's thoughts and experiences. There was no performative element, no need to impress or compete. "I have some news to share," I said, as Jessica served the homemade apple pie she had baked that afternoon. "I've been in discussions with the board about accelerating the transition timeline." Both Michael and Jessica looked up sharply, their expressions showing a mixture of anticipation and concern. "What does that mean exactly?" Michael asked. "It means that instead of waiting 10 to 15 years to begin transferring operational responsibilities, we're going to start next year. You'll both begin working directly with the resort management teams, learning the businesses from the ground up." Jessica set down her fork, her face pale. "Sharon, I don't know if we're ready for that. 6 months ago, I was treating you like a delusional old woman. How can you trust me with something so important so soon?" "Because the past 6 months have shown me everything I need to know about your character," I replied. "You've both demonstrated that you can change, that you can prioritize what's truly important, that you can learn from your mistakes. Those are the qualities that matter most in this work." Michael leaned back in his chair, clearly thinking through the implications. What would this transition look like practically? You would spend 6 months of the year traveling between properties, working alongside the existing management teams, learning every aspect of the operations. The other 6 months, you would be here, overseeing the administrative side of the business and developing new initiatives. "And you?" Jessica asked. "What would your role be during this transition?" "I would be your mentor and advisor, available whenever you need guidance but gradually stepping back to let you make your own decisions. Eventually, my role would be purely advisory, with you two taking full operational control." The room fell silent as they processed this information. I could see them both grappling with the magnitude of what I was proposing, the speed of the transition, and their own readiness for such enormous responsibility. "Can I ask why you want to accelerate the timeline?" Jessica said finally. I smiled, touched by her perceptiveness. "Because I've learned something important about life over the past year. Harold and I spent so many years building this empire that we forgot to fully enjoy it. We were always focused on the next project, the next acquisition, the next goal. I don't want to make the same mistake with the time I have left." "You're not sick, are you?" Michael asked, alarm evident in his voice. "No, sweetheart. I'm perfectly healthy. But I'm 70 years old, and I've realized that I want to spend my remaining active years doing things I never had time for when I was focused on business operations. I want to travel for pleasure instead of work. I want to volunteer for causes I care about. I want to spend time with any grandchildren you might give me someday." Jessica blushed at the implication, and Michael reached over to take her hand. They had been talking about starting a family, but had wanted to get their finances and their future settled first. "Most importantly," I continued, "I want to watch you both flourish in roles that utilize your talents and passion. Jessica, your ideas about community development and educational programs could transform how these properties interact with their local communities. Michael, your expertise in sustainable design could help us become leaders in eco-friendly resort development." "You really think we can do this?" Jessica asked, her voice small with uncertainty. "I know you can do this," I said firmly. "But more than that, I know you will do it with integrity, compassion, and wisdom. Harold would be incredibly proud of the people you've become and the leaders you're going to be." After dinner, we moved to the living room where Jessica had created a reading corner with comfortable chairs and good lighting. It was here that she spent her evenings studying business texts and hospitality journals, preparing herself for the responsibilities that lay ahead. "I've been thinking about something," she said as we settled in with cups of tea. "About the way I treated you, about the assumptions I made, about what that experience taught me about prejudice and privilege." Michael and I both looked at her expectantly, sensing that she was working through something important. "I want to establish a foundation," she continued. "Something that provides opportunities for people who face the same kind of dismissal and discrimination that I showed you. Elderly people who are overlooked because of ageism. Women who are underestimated because of their appearance or background. Anyone who gets written off because they don't fit someone else's narrow expectations." "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, intrigued by her idea. "Education scholarships, business development grants, mentorship programs. I want to create pathways for people to prove their worth when others refuse to see it. I want to make sure that talent and character are recognized regardless of packaging." Michael was nodding enthusiastically. "That's brilliant, Jess, and it fits perfectly with the values Mom and Dad built into these businesses. Harold always said that the best investments were in people, not properties." "Would this foundation be something you'd want to integrate with the existing business operations?" I asked. "I'd like it to be a separate entity," Jessica replied. "Something that stands on its own merit, funded by a percentage of the resort profits but operating independently. That way it can serve people and communities beyond those connected to our properties." I felt a surge of pride and excitement as I listened to Jessica outline her vision. This was exactly the kind of thinking that would take Harold's legacy to the next level, expanding its impact beyond business success to social transformation. "I think it's a wonderful idea," I said, "and I think you should start developing it immediately. Consider it your first major initiative as you transition into leadership." As the evening wound down and I prepared to return to my apartment, Jessica walked me to the door. She had done this every Saturday for months now, using the opportunity for private conversations away from Michael's protective presence. "Sharon," she said, her voice serious, I need you to know that I understand what you've given me, not just the financial resources or the business opportunities, but the chance to become someone I can respect. 6 months ago, I was turning into someone I hated, someone who measured worth by wealth and status. You saved me from that. You saved yourself, I corrected. I just provided some motivation for change. No, it was more than that. You showed me what real dignity looks like, what genuine strength looks like. You showed me that true power comes from character, not from money or position. That's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I hugged her tightly. This young woman who had transformed from my harshest critic into my most devoted student. The most important thing you can do now is pass that lesson on to others. Teach your children, your employees, everyone you encounter that people's worth isn't determined by their circumstances. I will, she promised. And Sharon? Thank you for believing in second chances. Thank you for seeing who I could become instead of just who I had been. As I drove back to my apartment that night, I reflected on the remarkable journey our family had taken over the past year. What had begun as a crisis born from financial irresponsibility and personal cruelty had become an opportunity for profound growth and positive change. Jessica's foundation would indeed become a reality, eventually providing millions of dollars in support for overlooked and underestimated individuals. Michael's sustainable design work would revolutionize the hospitality industry's approach to environmental responsibility. Together, they would expand Harold's empire not just in size, but in social impact, creating businesses that served as forces for good in the world. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned the lesson that Harold and I had sometimes forgotten in our own journey. That success without character is hollow, that wealth without wisdom is dangerous, and that the most valuable inheritance you can leave is not money but values. The woman who had once dismissed me as a delusional old woman living in poverty had become someone who understood that true wealth comes from how you treat others, how you use your advantages to help those with fewer opportunities, and how you choose to define success in your own life. And me? I had learned something important too. I had discovered that forgiveness isn't weakness, but strength. That second chances can lead to transformations beyond what anyone imagined possible. And that sometimes the people who hurt us most can become the ones who teach us the most about grace and redemption. Harold would have been proud of all of us, I thought as I settled into my simple apartment for the night. We had taken his legacy and made it something even more beautiful than what he had originally created. We had proven that with courage, humility, and genuine commitment to change, even the most damaged relationships could be healed and transformed into something stronger than they had ever been before. The next morning, Jessica called to tell me that she and Michael had spent the night talking about baby names and discussing how they wanted to raise their future children. They wanted to make sure their kids understood the value of hard work, the importance of treating everyone with respect, and the responsibility that comes with privilege. We want them to know their grandfather's story, Jessica said. And we want them to know your story too, Sharon. We want them to understand what real strength looks like and what it means to give people chances to become their best selves. As I hung up the phone, I smiled thinking about the grandchildren who would someday run through the halls of Harold's resorts, playing on beaches that their great-grandfather had transformed from failed development into thriving communities. They would grow up understanding that wealth was a tool for creating positive change, that business success was meaningless without social responsibility, and that the most important legacy you could leave was the example of how you treated other people. Jessica had been right about one thing from the very beginning. I did live in my own world. But it wasn't the world of delusion and fantasy she had imagined. It was a world where people could change, where mistakes could be redeemed, where second chances could lead to extraordinary transformations. It was a world where an elderly woman's quiet dignity could teach a young woman about true strength, where forgiveness could create opportunities for growth, and where love could triumph over prejudice and pride. And now, Jessica and Michael were citizens of that world too, ready to expand its borders and share its values with everyone they encountered. Harold's legacy was in good hands, but more than that, it was in hands that would use it to make the world a better place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.